This is the chapter 10 of my book 1970s America. The title of the chapter is Graduate Studies. The quality of teaching I encountered at UF in my first quarter was superior to that of IIT Kanpur. With the general atmosphere of scholarship, together with my enthusiasm for learning, made the graduate studies at University of Florida quite an enjoyable experience. Though I had done my MTech from IIT Kanpur, the level of graduate studies and the general atmosphere for doing good research somehow was lacking in this premier institute. Even today, the situation has not changed very much. In fact, I repeated quite a number of graduate courses at UF that I had already taken in IIT Kanpur, but still learned much more. With the desire for learning becoming stronger, I started spending long hours in the UF library. Reading journals and books in energy kindled a desire in me to broaden the scope of my work. Thus, I started looking at the wider picture of energy and especially how nature used solar energy for different purposes. We were trying to build in our lab a solar tracker so that the solar collectors could follow the sun for maximum interception of solar energy. Since sunflower tracks the sun in a rudimentary fashion, its knowledge I thought might be useful in designing a better solar tracker. Thus, I went to the botany department and talked with one of the professors and got the necessary literature regarding the Turger pressure, which makes the sunflower follow the sun, and other similar pressure related processes in green plants. Reading about this fascinating subject opened a whole new area of research for me, and one thing led to another, and I became extremely interested in how the trees take up the water and transport it to great heights, how the evaporation by the leaves takes place, etc. etc. The most important thing this approach taught me was that the nature knows best, and through millions of years of evolution, it has perfected the design, and hence we should follow it. I also realized that it works at nearly room temperature, and the efficiencies of energy conversion are very high. This is so since the energy available is less and in dilute forms, and to produce worthwhile output, nature has to develop extremely efficient energy transduction processes. This philosophy has guided me in all my design processes. Similarly, in our lab at UF, we were trying to develop an infrared sensor for measuring radiation from solar collectors. Again, I asked myself how nature senses temperature. I found out that the infrared sensors, IRS, of snakes like rattlesnake, pit viper, etc., are really fantastic systems with very high precision, and they can sense a temperature difference of about 0.01 degrees Celsius. This is how they catch their prey based upon the temperature difference between the prey and its surroundings. On both sunflower tracking and rattlesnake receptors, I gave seminars in the department sometime in 1976. These were probably some of the first seminars on biomimicry in the department and helped me later on to set up the university-wide multidisciplinary seminars. Unfortunately, I got sidetracked and did not proceed further on this line of research, and even today after 30 years, we still do not know very much about the plant movements, water transport in them, or the IRS of snakes, and how they can be used to design useful devices. Nevertheless, biomimicry nowadays is the flavor of the month, and very fascinating devices are being designed based on some of the natural systems. For my PhD work, I decided to work on desalination of seawater. I do not remember how I chose this topic, but once I had chosen it, I again looked towards nature for its inspiration. In nature, the seawater desalination takes place by its evaporation from sea surface by solar energy to form clouds, which subsequently convert into rain. The process of rain formation is aided by lightning, which helps in condensation of raindrops from very cold clouds. Thus, I embarked on the study of sea-water-air interface, how the solar energy is absorbed by the sea, and finally how lightning affects raindrop formation. In order to understand these phenomena, I took courses in electromagnetic field theory, in electrical engineering, interfacial phenomena in chemical engineering, and used to discuss cloud physics with one Dr. Uman, a very famous electrical engineering professor at UF, who was also one of the pioneers on lightning research in US and probably in the world. These courses and discussions gave me some insight into the whole process of rain formation, and so I decided to set up a couple of small experiments to duplicate the rain formation. In one experiment, I set up a deep basin solar distillation unit with dyes added to the water. This duplicated the interchange of solar energy with seawater, since majority of solar energy is absorbed within 1 meter of the sea surface. The dyed water also allowed the solar radiation to be absorbed in a very thin top layer. This helped increase the surface temperature of the water and hence the evaporation, and resulted in increased output of solar still. The second experiment I set up was in chemical engineering lab, where I started looking at the role of surfactants in increasing the evaporation rate. Surfactants help in breaking the hydrogen bonds in surface water and hence can help in increased evaporation. I conjectured that the biological life at the sea surface may be acting like surfactant and thus helping in increasing the evaporation rate. This conjecture is still being tested by various researchers, including Craig Venter of the Human Genome fame. Later on, I found that the Seawater Conversion Laboratory at University of California, Berkeley, had done a fair amount of work on the role of surfactants in increasing evaporation of seawater. That was one of the reasons to visit the lab in Berkeley in summer of 1976, so I felt I was on the right track. The third experiment I set up was in the electrical engineering lab regarding the use of high DC voltage, around 20 to 25 kilovolt, for increasing the evaporation of water. The idea was to flip-flop the surface water molecules to which a small amount of surfactant was added by using high voltage and frequency so as to break their bonds and hence to increase the evaporation. Besides, this also helped me set up a lightning discharges in small solar still. We did see some increased evaporation of water when continuous lightning discharge took place in the still. Later on, I discovered that Japanese had done some pioneering work in early 1970s on the use of electrical fields for enhancing water evaporation, but since their papers were written in Japanese and appeared only in Japanese journals, it was not easy to find out what they had done. I could set up these experiments in 1976 in all these labs because I had taken courses in these departments and the concerned professors were very helpful and appreciative of my efforts. Hence, for about 3 to 4 months, I used to shuttle between these labs on a daily basis. I would start experiment in one lab in the morning and would end up finishing another experiment in another lab very late at night. The thrill I felt in doing these experiments and thinking about them was almost like a yogic meditation, and got a first-hand experience of what inventors must have felt while working on cutting-edge research. This feverish intellectual activity allowed my brain to flower like it had never done before. It increased heightened awareness of almost everything and allowed me to look at any problem very deeply. In between the experiments, I would sit and write long essays on how the problems of India could be solved by the use of solar energy. In fact, I collated and condensed these writings later on, and they were published in 1978 as a half-page editorial article in Indian Express. Dr. Farber, being an inventor himself, appreciated my efforts and would come and watch these experiments with great curiosity in the lab. However, some of my other committee members were not very appreciative. One of them told me that they need a PhD from me and not a Nobel Prize. He almost gave me an ultimatum to choose one of the experiments for my PhD. He was actually helping me since he wanted me to finish my PhD in a short time and was afraid that with very innovative research in electrical fields and surfactants, it may take a very long time to do so. Since I was not very sure of the surfactant or the high voltage field projects, I chose the first project on the effect of dyes on solar distillation for my PhD. Besides my PhD topic, I also did a lot of reading and research the general field of seawater desalination. Some of these researchers also gave me a lot of publicity. There was a young lady at UF called Darcy Meeker, who was an Associated Press AP reporter, besides being a part of UF Publicity and Information Center. She somehow got a liking for what I was doing in energy. She therefore wrote about half a dozen stories on my work, which were not only published in the local papers but also in national papers, like Miami Herald, St. Petersburg Times, and Tampa Tribune, etc. Often the AP stories were picked up by the Indian press and appeared in the front pages of Times of India and Indian Express. In fact, two editorial articles in Times of India were written on these inventions. My parents would send me the newspaper clippings whenever they appeared. Quite a number of people informed me later on that I was probably the only Indian student in US to get so much publicity in Indian press in 1970s. Many people that I met in India in early 1980s remembered those stories. The Indian press was very appreciative of the fact that an Indian student was trying to develop technologies which might help solve India's energy crisis. Some of these stories, nevertheless, were quite embarrassing because they were based only on my ideas, not on any hardware development. That is where I realized that America is a land of ideas where any good idea is immediately picked up by the press, and I was not lacking in ideas. For example, one day I saw a TV program on the Public Broadcasting Service (PBS) channel on the beetle which collects dew on its backside in Namibian desert and uses that water to survive in the harsh atmosphere of desert. Since I was working on the problem of water, I immediately thought that dew should be an excellent source of fresh water production in desert areas. So I set up a full-scale experiment in our lab on dew collection and the factors affecting it and wrote a paper which was published in 1980 in the journal Desalination on large-scale dew collection using the data from this experiment. I am very proud of this work because today, after about 27 years, dew collection is becoming an important topic of research for fresh water production, and my paper is quoted extensively by the researchers working in this area. This work also gave me good publicity, and I was interviewed on the local TV channel in Gainesville, in addition to the news being published in international papers. Similarly, there were other stories written on my various technical papers that I published. Even when I was leaving UF to come to India, Darcy Meeker wrote a major story on how I was taking powerful ideas back home. My PhD work also gave me some publicity. I was very proud of this research where sophisticated mathematical modeling was used to validate the experimental results. Quite a number of industries later on used this simple technology of using dyes to enhance water evaporation by solar energy. I published a fairly long paper on it in Journal of Solar Energy, and it is quoted extensively by the solar distillation researchers. In those times, there was only one mainframe computers in UF and other universities since the desktop computing had not yet arrived. Besides, we used Fortran language for our computer programs. The program for my mathematical model was quite huge and it took about 10 to 15 minutes to run it. Thus, I used to run it only after midnight since the computer charges were least during this time. After each run, I would debug the program and again feed it into the computer. Feeding the program in those days was done through punch cards, and since my program was quite big, I had to carry it in a big box. Feeding and debugging was quite time consuming, and so quite a number of days I had to stay whole night in the computer center. In contrast, the life of a graduate student nowadays is so easy since he or she has an access to high-speed desktop computers. During my graduate studies, I also discovered an interesting ability in myself to go very deep into a subject, almost to the molecular level. This ability, which lasted for 5 to 6 months, was almost like a curse because any time I thought of an engineering problem, my mind would immediately go to the molecular level, and that is not a very good for engineering design. Nevertheless, this ability gave me wonderful ideas on solar energy utilization for electricity generation. I wrote them up in my diary, and I am delighted to know that only recently have some of these devices been made since new nonlinear optical materials have become available. This ability made me very vain, gave me a false pride and an ego that I was a great inventor. So I would go to the library to do some more research in areas I had chosen and invariably found out that somebody else had already thought about the same idea. This obviously deflated the ego but also gave me a satisfaction that I was on the right path, no matter how difficult the subject was. Thus, whenever somebody comes to me or makes a claim that he or she has done breakthrough research, I always tell them to look carefully at the old literature, since the chances of somebody else having thought about it long time back are very high. There is basically nothing new under the sun. I also did a fair amount of travel during my graduate studies. For example, I was invited by the American Association for Advancement of Science, AAS, to attend their annual meeting in Denver in 1977 and to participate as a panelist in a session on the relevance of US education for foreign students. They had invited about 20 foreign graduate students from all over US to debate and evaluate the effectiveness of US graduate program for such students. I was the only one selected from UF. It was a prestigious competition, and 20 of us from all the major universities in US were given $200 to travel to Denver. Besides, our stay was arranged with the local host families, and we were given a complimentary registration for the conference. Our foreign student session was acrimonious and reminded me of UN debates, with practically everybody blaming the US university system for not teaching material relevant to the foreign students' country problems. Mine was the only voice telling them that we came to US on our own accord, and so why should the US universities change their course of instruction to suit only foreign students? We should be intelligent and bold enough to take knowledge from this education which will be useful in our own countries. We have to make that choice and not the universities. I said, however, my voice was drowned out by the very aggressive tone of a couple of leftist type students who found fault in everything American. Incidentally, I found out later on that majority of these students who participated in this session and criticized American education settled down in US after their studies. I was probably the only one who went back. There were two interesting incidents that took place during this conference. The first one was about a senior Indian scientist. He was invited by AAS to present a paper on wind energy in one of the sessions, and was offered airfare from India plus waiver of registration fees. In those days, 1977, because of very strict foreign exchange regime in India, he got only $15 to $20 at Delhi airport, which was used up very rapidly in US. So he had no money to even have a meal, since his money from AAS was supposed to come after the conference was over. I sensed his predicament and fed him a couple of meals during the conference, for which he was eternally grateful. In fact, later on he retired as a head of National Lab in Bangalore and always remembered my generosity. The other incident took place in a E.F. Schumacher's session. In those days, E.F. Schumacher was a very famous economist from UK who achieved his fame because of his book called Small is Beautiful. In this book, Schumacher proposed the thesis of using Gandhian philosophy for developing of small energy self-sufficient communities and systems, as opposed to the existing large systems developed historically. The energy crisis of 1973 suddenly made Schumacher's thesis very popular. He was slated to give a lecture on this thesis in the session. Thus, he was a star attraction at the AAS annual meeting in Denver, and his session was a standing room crowd only. Because of Schumacher's popularity, the organizers of the session had kept him as the last speaker on the program. The speaker before him was from US Academy of Science, and just before he ended his speech, he told the audience that he had brought around 40 copies of book on energy for rural development, and that his office has published, and put them on the table for participants to take. He also informed the audience that this book is freely available from his office and would be sent to whosoever requested it. Despite that, there was a mad rush to take the book, and for the last book, two gentlemen in three-piece suit fought over it and tore the book in half. I saw no difference between the citizens of a super-rich society and beggars fighting for some food on the road in a very poor society. Freebies elicit the same response from all human beings. It was a 5-day conference, and every day I would call Nandini, since she was staying alone in our apartment in Gainesville. One day when I called her, she told me that somebody tried to open the door in our apartment at 5 a.m. in the morning. She was half asleep but kept on wondering why I would come so early in the morning from Denver. In any case, she called the campus police, but by the time they came, The intruder had run away. In those times, there was a lot of crime in Gainesville. In fact, it had started being called the rape city of US. In 1978, I was invited by the International Solar Energy Society to the International Conference in New Delhi. Our lab had sent 4 papers for presentation, and since Dr. Farber was unable to attend, I went to Delhi to present them. This was also a great opportunity for me to go back to India after almost 3 years, and so I jumped at the opportunity when it came in the form of an invitation by the Indian section of ISIS, or International Solar Energy Society. My uncle Dr. Atmaram had become India's Science and Technology Minister in 1977 in the Ministry of Sri Morarji Desai. ISIS was holding the meeting in New Delhi after a lapse of 24 years. The last ISIS conference had been held in Delhi in 1954, and Dr. Atmaram was the patron of the conference. He had been following my career path at UF with great interest, and since I was a student of Dr. Farber, I was sent an invitation and a promise of partial airfare to attend the conference. In late 1976, Dr. Farber had gone to India as the head of high-powered US delegation in solar energy. He had met the Energy Minister, Mr. K.C. Pant, and other senior Government of India energy officials. He also met my father, who took him to meet Dr. Atmaram, who was a leading retired life at the time, and Shri Sundarlal, the senior member of Parliament of Congress Party. I was told later on by my father that Dr. Farber praised me a lot to Dr. Atmaram, and thus when he became the science minister, he suggested to ISIS that I should be invited if Dr. Farber was not coming to the conference. I found the conference quite dull, with not too many new inventions, and the focus more on rudimentary and simple solar devices which could be made easily available by rural and could be easily made by the rural population. Since it was taking place in Delhi, hence the participants of US and European scientists was somehow hence the participation of US and European scientists was somehow minimal. I presented our 4 papers and must have made some impression, because later on when I came back to India, quite a number of solar energy researchers who were in those sessions remembered me. This visit to India also gave me an opportunity to meet my in-laws for the first time. They took me to Phaltan from Mumbai, then Bombay, and showed me their setup. I hardly paid any attention to it since I was least concerned about it and was the last thing on my horizon. How wrong I was, since this is a place I finally chose to settle down in. If I had an iota of intelligence, I would have paid more attention to what my father-in-law was trying to tell me. This was a whirlwind tour of India where I stayed for 15 days only. However, when I returned back to New York on Air India flight, I felt a sense of happiness at coming back to US as if I was coming home. I was a little embarrassed by this feeling of mine, since I always prided myself about the fact that I wanted to go back to India, but felt this new feeling for the first time. It could either be because of the stark contrast that I found between the conditions in India and US, or the general gloomy feeling that I felt in the Indian intelligentsia that I met in Delhi, despite the fact that the general elections had thrown out Mrs. Gandhi, the dictator. Or it also could be because I had my wife in US to whom I wanted to go back to as early as possible. Nonetheless, this feeling of happiness of going back to US was very strong. Still, when I reached Gainesville, I was bubbling with enthusiasm regarding what was possible for India. I do not remember now, but Nandini later on told me that I talked non-stop for almost 2 days about the Indian trip and the excitement I felt. Just after my return to Gainesville, one of the top energy officials of Government of India came to see our solar energy lab and to meet Dr. Farber. I had met him in Delhi during the ISIS conference. I had made reservations for him to stay for 2 days in the Rights Union guest house at $15 per night. However, he wanted to save the money and insisted on staying with us. We used to live in a married student housing or apartment with only 1 bedroom and a combined kitchen and living room. This high-ranking Government of India official therefore slept for 2 days on the floor in our living room. It was really a pathetic how some of these people behaved for saving few dollars when the government of India was providing all the money for their travel and stay. Later on, whenever I met this official in Delhi and alluded to the subject of how he stayed with us, he would squirm and feel extremely embarrassed. From the time I came back from India till I finished my PhD, there was a period of almost 1 year. This was also one of my most productive years. I wrote extensively on a variety of subjects and was quite active in developing various projects though my PhD work took a major portion of my time. During this time, I also somehow became interested in gravity and so read a lot on it. One day, sometime in fall of 1978, I was coming back to my office from my apartment after lunch when a thought suddenly came to me that human thought and gravity have similar characteristics. The thought came with tremendous force, and for the next 3 4 months, I immersed myself in this subject. Dr. Farber was alarmed to see this diversion and warned me that I would not be able to finish my PhD if I diverted my energies to this long term venture. I heeded his advice and finished my PhD by March 1979. Nevertheless, this powerful thought of human thought gravity interaction propelled me to start my quest for spirituality, which I had abandoned for almost 13 years. This quest for spirituality has continued even today and has resulted in a book published in 2004. But then this is a different story. My PhD defense took place in March 1979. I wore a simple shirt and pants. Some of my committee members remarked why I was not dressed up in a formal attire of suit. I told them that they should be more interested in listening to my presentation and not focus on what I wore. My arrogance knew no bounds. I also never went to the graduation ceremony in June 1979 since neither I nor my professor Farber was fond of the pompous ceremony, though I could be wrong because Farber did like some of these processions and these interactions. I was lucky that Dr. Farber never interfered in my thesis work. I had selected my topic and followed it up till its defense, with minimum help either from him or other committee members. I think Dr. Farber also liked my independent nature and in fact was very pleasantly surprised at the amount and quality of work I had done when he read my thesis for the first time. I was therefore glad that I followed my hunch of not going to any other school but sticking with UF. Dr. Farber was a very difficult person to work with, yet he was a great engineer and innovator, and I learned a lot from him. I have always believed that one should try to take the good things from a person. The negative attributes are his or her own baggage. If we focus on their negative attributes, then we also acquire a part of that baggage. It is not easy to follow this philosophy, but if done, then it results in tremendous knowledge gain. The 4.5 years that I spent in doing my graduate work at UF were some of the happiest years of my life. The tremendous intellectual activity that took place without any responsibilities or worries gave me immense pleasure.